You are listening to Necropolis Podcast, which is brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion Magazine. Welcome to Necropolis. Today we're doing another classical episode. So the focus of today, as you can see from the title, is Beethoven. So it was only a matter of time until we got to Beethoven because he's such a monumental composer. I consider for the longest time that he was the best composer ever, and then now I'm kind of torn between him and Bruckner. But Beethoven is really that composer that is very, very important to me, and I probably would not be as obsessive about classical music if it weren't for Beethoven. So anyway, we do have a packed house today. We have the whole crew here for some classical music talk. Of course, we have Sebastian Ledokar. Thank you for coming back, sir.
Hello, everyone.
Hello. And we do have the co-host today. I think this is the first time. Oh, no, he was on the original classical music episode, but he hasn't done a specific composer one yet. So we do have Shelly from HateMeditations.com and Metal Legion Magazine. Thank you for joining us, Shelly.
Hello. I'm only a little bit nervous about doing such a deep dive, but we'll see how it goes. But yeah, good to be here.
Yeah. And we also have Tyler rejoining us today. Tyler's been on quite a few band discussion, the focus episodes, and I believe today is his first time talking about a classical composer. So thank you for joining, Tyler.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to talk about Beethoven.
Yes, sir. So we can talk about personal anecdotes, but honestly, I think that's not going to be interesting for people to listen to about Beethoven. But yes, Beethoven was that composer that as soon as it clicked for me, I was freaking obsessed with classical music. And before then, it was very spotty. I listened to Wagner and Chopin and things like that. But Beethoven was the composer that made me obsess over classical music, and especially his own music. So, and from Beethoven, and I sprang in all these other wonderful composers. And now I feel like I took a music appreciation course, and I got hundreds on everything. That's how obsessive I was about music, that I literally got hundreds on everything. And the professor even said, because I answered a question correctly and he marked it wrong, and he's like, Jason, an A is an A. It's like, don't worry about getting hundreds on everything. But Beethoven was what sparked that interest for me to become so obsessive about classical music. So just kind of talk about Beethoven. Everyone knows about, that he was pretty much the catalyst for Romanticism. A lot of people still can classify him as a classicist. So Beethoven did come from the classical period, which was, Haydn and Mozart. And the first two symphonies are very much in that vein, very much in that classical vein. But with the third symphony, he did blow out the walls. And I find that's the most fascinating part about Beethoven, where he starts breaking molds and doing it in such a way that, at the time it was lambasted by critics, but eventually the population came on board with what Beethoven was doing. By the time the Ninth came out, it was such a monumental piece that it was always referred to after it was written as the Ninth. So whenever someone said the Ninth, it was referring to Beethoven stuff. So it kind of shows how he broke a lot of molds early on, and ticked off half of the critics while doing so. But by the end of his career, he pretty much had everyone on board. So Sebastian, what are your kind of thoughts about Beethoven?
Yeah, it's difficult to classify Beethoven. He, of course, his first master was Haydn, and then Mozart also. But it's his first works obviously belong to this period. He made a sort of mix of Haydn and Mozart, and then he became very quickly very personal. And the very first masterwork, I would say, very authentic masterwork, is the first set of six string quartets, Opus 18, which are absolutely masterful. And already we can see that Beethoven had very big ambition about developing the form and having a strong sense of developing his musical ideas. And at the same time, it's difficult to classify him as a romantic or not completely as being as a romantic, because I don't feel him as being, I would say, sentimental. You know, he's very interested in the form. It's quite and very often an intellectual music. Sometimes you can have in some of his symphonies a hidden political message. For example, the Eroica Symphony, which was initially dedicated to Napoleon, or the Fifth also. It has a sort of hidden program, and but I don't feel his music being a sort of how to say that. I don't. I feel it difficult to classify it next to Chopin or Schumann, for instance. It's difficult for me because he belongs to another category, I would say.
Right, yeah. Like I've called him like a proto-romanticist, but I've heard people refer to him as a classicist, which, you know, the young Beethoven was certainly a classicist, but in that music appreciation course, the professor, he just turned on the radio, the classical music station, and he's like, "Oh, this is some romanticist work," and it was actually Beethoven that I forget what it was, like a string quartet or something like that, but and it was actually a Beethoven work where he just broke so many molds. It's really hard to kind of categorize him. Like he had 1 foot in classicism, and then 1 foot in like just breaking molds to such an extent that he was literally the catalyst of, you know, that romanticist movement that came after him, where, you know, there was Mendelssohn and Brahms and Schubert. All of them came after Beethoven. So Shelley, what are your general thoughts about Beethoven, or what his music means to you?
Yeah, I think that's one of the real beauties of his work, is that not only can you track the progression of him as an artist from his early career through to the later works, but that almost was a representation of what was happening to classical music at the time, and it evolving into romantic music. And whether you want to position him as a kind of rounding off or summarizing the classical era, or as a proto-romanticist, as you said, it really ultimately it comes down to the fact that he kind of, because he bisects the two eras almost too perfectly in a way, but that is also a hallmark of a lot of great works within music in general as well, and art, where they have something of the sort of backward looking traditionalist to them, but also the forward thinking inventor, almost someone that's trying to find their identity through creating something new. And for me, being most familiar with the piano sonatas, you can really see that evolution take place when you track them through, and the earlier ones are much more formal and kind of adhere to the kind of, you know, the structures of the classical form, and then slowly but surely Beethoven's character comes through. And I think that's what makes him so compelling compared to a lot of the other composers you mentioned, who I do also love, but yeah, just sort of lack that intimate knowledge, because you can sort of engage with it on both an intellectual level, but also on a very personal and emotional level, you know, also based on what we kind of know about him as a man at the time as well, and what he was going through at various stages of his life as well. And I think that's what makes him such a special composer as well, beyond the obvious sort of brilliance of his seminal works as well.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, definitely. There's so many different sides to Beethoven. Like you listen to the classical side of him, then just the sheer innovation, continual innovation too. Like with the Ninth Symphony, there's the first movement, like a double sonata form. Things that are just like way advanced music, technically speaking, and also the Grosse Fuge, which I'm sure Sebastian has studied that quite a bit more than we have. But even with that, that's sheer modernism. Like that's modernism at late in his career, and I believe he was completely deaf when he wrote that, as he was with the Ninth as well. So, Tyler, what are your kind of thoughts about Beethoven before we delve into his symphonies?
Beethoven is one of my favorite composers in my earliest introduction to classical music. I agree with the general sentiment about his early material sounding more like his influences in Haydn and Mozart, and his later material carrying some hallmarks of what would later go on to define Romantic music. Uh, I enjoy some of his early material, particularly the Second Symphony, but I definitely think that more of his individual character became defined in his later works. And of course, his later works are mostly what he's known for. But I would also agree that he is one of the finest composers in the Western classical tradition. He has a great sense of passion to his work. And while his later work might, unlike some of the romanticists that followed him, still adhere somewhat to a classical sense of very even and formal structure. He does experiment in harmony and somewhat in melody with using certain forms of dissonances that weren't as common in the classical period, although you can find some examples, and in melody with a much more individual character, even in structure with experimentation with making the music more expressive on a sort of personal and like individual level. And I can't express my praise for him enough. So yeah, that's about all I would have to say for an introduction, I suppose.
Awesome. So, yeah, I find the first two symphonies of Beethoven to be the least interesting out of his entire symphonic canon. So, I'll let Sebastian take the reins on the first symphony because the only criticism I have is it sounds too much like Mozart to me. But Sebastian, what are your thoughts about the first symphony of Beethoven?
Mm. I think I could not completely agree with you, but indeed, the real first great symphony by Beethoven is the Eroica, the third symphony. But there are signs of strong individuality already with the first symphony. He had some remarks from his contemporaries when the symphony was performed for the first time, and they said it sounds like military music because you have a lot of woodwinds and trumpets and horns in the symphony, more than in a symphony by Haydn or Mozart. And it doesn't sound exactly the way of Haydn or Mozart, but the form, the style is absolutely classical for sure. But indeed, this symphony, you don't feel, I would say, the strong individuality or it's experimental. This is the young Beethoven. He shows his abilities, his capabilities as a symphonist with the first attempt. But the real symphony that we can identify really as being in the style of the authentic Beethoven is the second. It doesn't has the size and the greatness maybe of the third symphony, but the orchestration of the second symphony is clearly it's the universe, the sound universe of Beethoven, and this kind of orchestra we will have it until the ninth symphony. You have more virtuosity in the strings in this symphony, and the use of the form is more developed than it's not completely classical. We can observe, especially in the first movement, with the development of a quite huge and long sonata form. It's approximately 10-12 minutes for the first movement, depends on the tempo, but the scale is beginning to change. And of course, with the third symphony, with the Eroica, the first movement, the sonata form is becoming completely colossal. It's a colossal sonata form with huge development, but we can already feel this kind of process in the second symphony in terms of orchestration and the importance of development. So I would not say that these are minor works. These are great symphonies, but obviously the third nails it.
Yeah, with the Eroica, I mean, that's something any person should know, is the Eroica and how important that symphony was. And I believe, and I'm going back 10 years to 15 years, my memory of listening to a lecture on it, and like the first movement, the recapitulation doesn't happen for like 8 minutes, correct?
Approximately.
Yeah, and that was completely unheard of back then, correct? Was
Yes, that's the length of the development, and what's the main characteristic of the first movement of this symphony is that the coda is a sort of second development. So it's a huge, there is a huge process of continuous development in it, and this is like also the slow movement, the funeral march, is something very special in the symphonic world. You can find, of course, for example, the Military Symphony by Haydn, the 100th Symphony. You have a slow movement evoking military band, but with such character, with such drama in the music. And you have in the middle of this slow movement a long fugue, very intense music. And what is also very special about this symphony, it's the harsh character, the sharpness of it, the brutality of it. And this is the real Beethoven, which is here revealing himself in this symphony, because that's the giant. But you know, I think there is something savage in his music, but it's a sort of controlled savagery, and that's the balance between being very eruptive, like a volcano, and civilized at the same time. And the balance with Beethoven is always how to say that, going on one side and on the other side, and it's not always completely steady, but he tries to be in control of that. But you can feel the kind of insanity that there is in his music, and it is revealed in this third symphony, that the finale with this series of variation, when it is performed with the correct tempi, I would say, because it's very important to follow, or to be as close as possible to his own metronome indications. When you follow these indications, the music is sometimes at the limit of being possible to play. Because I think that in his head, maybe he had also the ambition to exhaust the musicians of the orchestra. It's absolutely, you have this kind of insanity. We have a lot of symphonies by Haydn or Mozart which are already very virtuosic, but with Beethoven, that's a different scale, and the message is really titanic, gigantic.
Right, with the third symphony, and especially if the listener is very unfamiliar with Beethoven and that third symphony, definitely check it out. And especially that darkness of the slow movement, the funeral march, and the fugal form in there it's eye-opening the first time you really listen to it and absorb it. But wasn't Beethoven going deaf? Like he discovered he was going deaf around the period, around the time when he wrote his third.
It was, I think, I can remember it was 1802. So it was at the time when he was composing the second symphony.
I see.
And that's the time when he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament. He was in a little village in the area of Vienna. He was in the countryside, and he wrote a testament to his brothers, and he was thinking about committing suicide because he was obviously becoming more and more deeply deaf, and he didn't kill himself, hopefully, but that was yes, at that time. And the Eureka is 1803, 1804.
Yeah, so he had already known he was going deaf when he wrote that. So that had to, just that personal turmoil had to, play a big part with that third symphony as well, and wanting to make a big statement and letting the inner character come out. Shelley, did you have something to say?
Well, I was actually going to say the exact same thing, in that in part the third symphony was almost a statement of defiance at the revelation that he was going deaf, and him deciding that he was going to not let it overcome him, and actually sort of feed that into compositions. And my understanding is that that's why things started to get a bit more abrasive by that point, and louder as well, because he's sort of injecting it with his own sort of anger, but also defiance at the fact that this is his life, this is his reason for being, and it's being taken away from him by a physical ailment.
Yeah, didn't he think like the reason that he was going deaf was because of like digestive issues or something like that? And like I know he hated diarrhea with a passion because he had some issues there. And he would like throw his head into cold water thinking that would help his hearing. Like what are your thoughts about like how he treated his deafness, Sebastian?
There are different hypotheses about that, but I think that's my understanding of his biography, and that's the wrong answer to this question, but I think that's the correct answer. When he was young, his father was beating him, and I think that was the consequence of it. There was a how to say that in English, a calcification of the bones in the ear. I don't know if the word is correct in English, calcification, and the
Weakening of
the bones of the ear are sticked together. They're moving no more properly.
That's interesting. I didn't know his father beat him. That's horrible. But I know
The father was an alcoholic, and he wanted to do with his young Ludwig. He wanted to make of him a sort of second Mozart and show him in the court. But Beethoven was not as talented as Mozart as a young boy, and it turned very badly with the father.
I had no idea. But people they often look at Beethoven as a child prodigy, though, like Mozart was, but not at the same caliber. Sebastian, they weren't at the same.
Not exactly. I don't think he was so as mature as Mozart was. Maybe he had more difficulties with the virtuosity with the as a young boy. So it's not obvious he was as talented as Mozart.
I see. That's interesting. But I feel like the music he created, far transcends what Mozart accomplished. But so he wrote his third symphony. It was this great statement of his vision of where.
But he became a virtuoso by hardworking, I think.
Right. So he released, he came out with the premiere of the third symphony, and about half of the critics lambasted it as, just crazy music that made no sense and, abandoned, a lot of the principles of the classical tradition. Whereas, it's very classical. It's just different, a different view of what classicism could be. But then after that, he came off his fourth, and his fourth, it's darker, it's a little bit more powerful in some areas, but it's really it's not as a big of a statement as the third. So what are your general thoughts about the fourth symphony?
The question is for me?
Yes, sir. Sebastian?
Yes. I would say that the fourth is a kind of second symphony improved. And it's a very joyful work, but it starts very, I would not say dark, but mysterious. There is a long introduction in minor mode, and it seems to tell us I'm going to speak about very serious matter, and then the allegro is just starting with some interjections in the violins, and when it starts, it's complete joy, complete how to say that. I don't find the words. Sorry, in English. Like drunk of joy, ivre de
Euphoria?
joie. Euphoria, yes, yes, euphoric, yes, euphoria, and
Yeah.
the whole work after this long introduction Mysterious Introduction is just it's probably his most happy symphony by far. The finale is very crazy. It's a run, it's a race, but it's a happy race. The scherzo is just joyful, playful, and the slow movement is something majestic. I would say a little bit military also, but and also at the same time very melodic, a little bit melancholic, but not just not too much. And it's a very joyful music, very beautiful work, very positive work. And for me, it's a diamond. This symphony. It's really it's even better than the fifth. I would say in terms of form. I find it very convincing, but quite still very classical in shape, and the development in the first movement is approximately the same size as in the first movement of the second symphony, but it's approximately the same scale as the second symphony, the same duration, and but I find it very catchy, also very easy to listen to. I think it's not so often performed. I don't understand why, because it's very catchy. I would say it's a very great symphony. It's a diamond, a jewel.
Yeah, I subconsciously channeled it with one piece I wrote a long time ago. A little project called GoCraft, and the final track on the first album, I actually play the same melody as the opening bars, and I had no idea what I was doing at the time, but it's very intuitive music. It's very natural sounding, and I also do consider it to be better than the fifth. I'm probably one of the few people out there who is not a huge fan of the fifth. I can admire it on a lot of different levels, but for me, just to listen to it, just to enjoy, I prefer some other symphonies by Beethoven. So before we delve into the fifth, Shelley or Tyler, did you have any thoughts about the continuation from the third to the fourth?
No thoughts in particular. I mean, other than just on a personal level, noting that the fourth is one of my favorite symphonies. I mean, typically by Beethoven, I kind of somewhat stick to the even numbers. I like the second, I like the fourth, and I like the eighth. The sixth, not so much. But yeah, I do agree with Sebastian's analysis that the fourth is a very joyful symphony, despite its deceptively sort of minor tone in the beginning. And I think that after the sort of monumental revolution of the third, it also is interesting to note that the fourth has somewhat more of a classical form. And the third does to a certain extent too, but the third, and I would say my like sort of like unique contribution would be the third almost in some ways seems somewhat more revolutionary or daring than the fourth symphony does, despite the fact that I prefer the fourth.
That's interesting that you like the even numbers. I've never heard anyone on the planet say that before. Because a lot of those most famous works are the odd ones. They're the third, fifth, seventh, and ninth. And it's like, well, you're the complete opposite.
You hipster.
I know, right? Yeah, those are just the ones I tend to prefer. The first symphony that got me into Beethoven was the ninth, which I feel like is pretty stereotypical. But yeah, I do like the even numbers more.
Interesting. Shelley, how about you?
Well, I was gonna be the basic bitch of the group and say I absolutely love the fifth, and I think the fourth possibly gets overlooked because it is jammed between the third and the fifth. And I'm one of those people that does tend to overlook it for that reason. And I think obviously the fifth is sort of riddled with cliches by this point, because it's one of the most famous pieces of music ever written. But I also tend to think, like, returning to it, it is worth it. I think some more hardcore classical fans and Beethoven fans would tend to just kind of step away from it because it is, it does tend to be overplayed, and it's almost a meme at this point. but I think sort of returning to the original work is worth it, and there is a lot to admire about it, and I think it is as good as kind of posterity has made it out to be. So yeah, that might make me a bit of a Route One Beethoven fan, but that's kind of the way I feel.
Well, it's kind of like the Fifth Symphony. He kind of continues the heroic theme from the first movement of his third, and he kind of goes back into that vein with the Fifth Symphony. And I can appreciate on that level, like he's finalizing that initial vision with the Fifth. Sebastian, what are your kind of thoughts on the Fifth?
Just a last comment about the fourth. I would say that it's some elements of the fourth are a sort of announcing the Seventh Symphony, and especially the finale. In the finale, you have a sort of motoric, repetitive movement. And in the finale of the Seventh, you have this kind also of, it's also very joyful, but this joy become, it's flirting with madness sometimes. It's so much powerful that the music becomes quasi insane. And we have already this kind of very brutal energy and volcanic joy in the finale of the Fourth Symphony, with a lot of rhythmic games, syncopes, for instance, and he does that also in the finale of the Seventh. So. And the fifth, of course, the fifth is the big symphony, the symphony of the all the symphonies. I don't have particularly special or interesting thoughts about the fifth. I would say that it's very important once again to follow his metronome indications, because the fifth is maybe the first movement, for instance, one of the biggest caricature many conductors made of Beethoven. And when you perform the first movement too slow, we lose the kind of, you know, the guy boxing, the fight, the struggle of the music. If the tempo is too slow, we are losing it completely. With his ta 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 ti 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 ta 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 ta, it becomes heavy, not flowing, not excited. And I think that the music requires this excitement. And you know, there is a lot of discussion and papers about the metronome indications of Beethoven being not accurate. His metronome was broken. He was deaf. It's impossible to perform some of his metronome indications. But I think that's wrong. They all works perfectly, but sometimes indeed it's very, very fast. It's very difficult. And for the first movement of the fifth, it's important, I think, to strictly follow or to be as close as possible to his metronome indication, to have this rush, this flow, this violence of the music, to be harassed by the music.
Okay.
Otherwise, the flow is lost.
Should it go bum 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 bum, or should it go bum 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 bum? How fast should we go? Bum 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 bum, like that?
Yes, probably the first two phrases you can do them. You can play them maybe a little bit more spacious. But when the music, the motoric music is starting, you need this tempo, this emergency. Otherwise, the music vanishes.
Shelley.
Yeah, I was just following on from that as well, just anecdotally. This is a few years ago now, but I remember trying to listen to the version on Spotify. I'm not sure if it's still up there. I can't remember who the conductor was, but it was a much slower, dirgier version than the one I'm used to. And it was almost like listening to an entirely different piece of music, where there was no punch, there was no kind of that percussive element to it that really is required to bring that theme to life.
Was it still Badachi?
Sorry?
Was it still Badachi, the conductor?
I honestly can't remember now. This was a few years ago, but yeah, it was just a much slower version where the notes didn't really kind of articulate themselves properly. But I was also going to say, just obviously it's hard to talk about the fifth and sort of say anything new on it, because what can you add to everything that's already been said? But I would say, even if you think it's either overrated or not really one of Beethoven's best symphonies, it's still sort of a perfectly constructed piece of music. Like its symmetry and its kind of intuitive flow it's almost like admiring a really well constructed building or a really sort of elegant piece of architecture. And also that the opening theme as well, I believe that theme makes an appearance in a lot of Beethoven's work. I know it arrives in the 23rd Piano Sonata as well, that da-da-da-dum theme. It's almost like a faltering heartbeat or something. But even throughout the symphony as well, beyond the first movement, just the way it flows into each other is just, I could admire it on a technical and intellectual level, as well as the artistry behind it.
What's that word that Sebastian said earlier about struggle? There's struggle throughout the entire Fifth Symphony. He continues that, and that's like a continuation from the Eroica. So yeah, I personally, it's not one of my favorite symphonies by Beethoven, just because it is overplayed a lot, and I find that there's other works by him that are more fascinating to me personally. But yeah, I'll never bash it on its music itself. But there's like the Sixth Symphony. I actually really, really love the Pastoral Symphony, especially when the storm comes in. You can kind of imagine the animals run to shelter. The storm clouds are coming in, and boom, and then here come the cello with this big ominous undertone to the music. I love it. So let's delve into the Sixth Symphony. I'll start with Sebastian, since he's the biggest expert on this podcast today. What are your general thoughts about the Sixth Symphony, Sebastian?
I'm not sure Beethoven would agree with what I'm going to say, but probably it's the kind of the symphony is the first tone poem, I would say. But there is a text in front of the score saying it's more a feeling than a description of the nature. But every movement has a title. As you said, the fourth movement is the storm, and the third movement, the scherzo, is the peasants, in the countryside dancing and so on. And there is a descriptive element clearly in the slow movements. You have the birds singing, literally the cuckoo, for example, really doing playing this song, and so this is probably one of the first tone poems, so to say, and it influenced most probably until Richard Strauss' Alpen Symphony, for instance, and but at the same time, the symphony is quite classical. because if you take out the storm, you have four classical movements, very classical movements, like a Haydn symphony, and the orchestration is quite smaller than even if you have the trombones in the at the end, but the symphony is more chambristic, I would say, more chamber music, and then the fifth or the Eroica, and it's quite a light symphony, joyful symphony also. There is no particularly violence or darkness in it. I don't feel it. Even the storm it's an impressive music, but you don't feel threatened by it. So this is why I say it's probably half descriptive, half music, I would say. That's not my favorite, I must confess.
So Tyler, I know it's not your favorite either. What are your thoughts? Like, why isn't it one of your favorites, Tyler?
Well, when I say it's not one of my favorites, it's like comparing to the entire collection of symphonies, right? I would say I like the sixth more than I like the fifth, possibly more than I like the third and the seventh, and not quite sure how I would feel about it compared to the ninth, but I just don't like it as much as the symphonies that I listen to most regularly, which, like I said, is the second and the fourth and the eighth. But as far as how I feel about it, I think it's a very wonderful piece of music. Same way I feel about even the symphonies that I would rate the lowest, which would be like the fifth or perhaps the first or the seventh. They're all wonderful pieces of music. I enjoy listening to them when the time arises. I think that Sebastian's analysis is pretty much spot on. It was something that I noted once while listening to it, even with my uneducated ear, that it was somewhat surprising in comparison to the third or the fifth symphony, how in classical terms conventional the structure of the six was, barring the storm music for the sake of the program. So that was something that was really interesting to hear him say, since it was something that I kind of noticed myself when listening to it. And I think he's also right in saying that it doesn't have as much of the extremely passionate violence as some of Beethoven's other major themes from his other symphonies have. But in that, I find it also kind of interesting, right? You get to see an aspect of Beethoven that I think is arguably a big part of his music, which is between the clashing, thunderous violence, very long, flowing style of melody, which, granted, early on was probably really influenced by Mozart, who in the classical tradition, along with many other composers, utilized a long flowing style of melody. But over time, he began to add his own characteristics to it, especially in later works like some of his string quartets, where he began to pair that long flowing sense of melody with a sort of unconventional or at least experimental style of harmony.
Yeah, I would say as a piece of programmed music, it works both if you are following the intention of, you know, what the themes and the events that it's describing, but it works even if you completely ignore that and take it as a piece of music in its own right. But to come back to that idea of the tension within the symphony and the broader tension within Beethoven's music, yeah, I totally concur with the thought that it is a much more classical symphony, but also that kind of brings with it a sense of intimacy as well. If you look at sort of the fifth as being very cinematic and theatrical, although the sixth is an actual narrative, it has a sense of sort of intimate informality to it when he's, you know, referencing the peasants and the, you know, the flutes and sort of the dances and things like that, which, you know, bring it almost aligned with sort of the informalities of folk traditions and stuff, and sort of bridging the rigid strictures of classical music with that as well. And I think it's just because it came after the fifth, it's just quite an interesting left turn to take. And for that, I always think I listen to it far less than the fifth, I will admit, but I always find it a very interesting listen. There's always something else to unpack about it, because it's sort of, you could look at it in its own right and take the musical components completely independent of the themes, or you can sort of go through and look at all of the things that he's trying to work into it and the literal references to these natural events that are occurring as well. So it's a very interesting piece of music.
Yep, and like Sebastian was saying, it might be perhaps a first instance of a legitimate tone poem with the way that he did lay out the different scenes per the movements and all that. So it does conjure up the specific images in your mind when you listen to it, if you listen to it the way it's intended to be listened to. So moving on to the seventh, and seventh is like the fifth and the ninth are it's very, very popular because the Allegretto, the second movement, is, you know, been in a lot of movies and pop culture and all that, but it's still a phenomenal piece of counterpoint that's in that movement. I love it to death, honestly, even though it is, you know, very mainstream, quote unquote, or pop culture. Sebastian, what are your thoughts about the seventh, like compared to the sixth, moving on to the seventh?
So the fifth and the sixth were composed approximately at the same period and were created in the same concert, and that's the same about the seventh and the eighth. So it's like Janus phases, I would say, in the fifth and the sixth. The fifth being the dark, the sixth being the more positive. The seven is not completely dark, but there is some darkness in it, especially in the allegretto, in the second movement, but not only, because I think, especially the finale, as I already said, there is some sort of insanity in it, because the music is so extreme. You have this driving energy. In a way, he's trying to test the limits of the orchestra. If you follow his metronome indications, so most of the time, the slow introduction of the first movement is too slow, and as well as the allegro, it's very difficult to find recordings following his metronome indications. There are very few of it. And the tendency for the second movement, the allegretto, is to play it like a funeral march, and to make a sort of base of the funeral march of the third symphony of the Eroica. But that's not the same kind of music at all. And it's the metronome marking is quite clear. It's approximately tam tam ta 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 ta, this kind of tempo, and not tim 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 tim, which is way too slow. So it's important, once again, that the following to be as close as possible. Of course, sometimes you can perform a work in a hall with a large acoustic, so you have to be a little bit behind the metronome in indication of the composer, just to adapt to the hall. But when it's possible, when you have a dry and clear acoustic, it's important to try to follow the metronome markings, because the tempo you choose to perform a piece of music is it gives the main character, and from it everything will comes naturally. And this movement, when you follow the metronome marking, you can feel more the inevitability of this music. When it's too slow, I already made this kind of comment about Bruckner. When you stretched out the music, you dissolve it. The energy of it, the flowing of the phrases are vanishing. And I think it's very important with Beethoven to trust the composer about his metronomic indications, and he's not the only one to have to use these metronomic indications for his works. Schumann did the same. Dvorak also. Many other Chopin for his etudes, or for instance. So it was important during the 19th century to write down metronome indication. So it's part of the score. We don't I think we don't have to neglect these metronome indications. The third movement of the Seventh Symphony is a very special scherzo because you have the same kind of madness that you have in the finale of the fourth, and it's a sort of preparation of the extreme energy we will have will experience in the finale, and it's a sort of a symphony with a long first movement, a quite well balanced, not slow but moderate second movement, and the two last movements, third and fourth, are extremely energetic and very fast movements. So it's a symphony full of energy, and it's difficult, I think, when you follow Beethoven's indication to keep your energy until the end. For an orchestra, for live performance, I guess it must be very difficult to keep your energy until the end.
Interesting. Just off the cuff question here, Sebastian. I know one conductor, and he said he told me years ago that the composer may not always know best when it comes to the tempo. What are your thoughts on that? Are there any instances of that you know of where a composer might have wrote down metronome markings that perhaps aren't the strongest markings, that it could be adjusted to have a greater impact?
That's a broad topic. In the specific case of Beethoven, I think that there is just two issues about Beethoven's metronome markings. That's they are in the nines, and I already sent a talk by Benjamin Zender, who explains that for the Ninth Symphony, Beethoven prepared the metronome markings with the help of his nephew, Carl van Beethoven. And probably Carl, the nephew, made two mistakes while transcribing the intentions of Beethoven. So it could explain why these two indications are problematic. But for the other indications, there is no good reason not to follow them. For other composer, maybe I that doesn't come to my mind. For Bruckner, certainly not. For Schumann, for the fourth symphonies, all the metronome indications are perfectly consistent, logical. And as well for Dvorak, the 8th and the 9th symphony, all the metronome markings are absolutely correct, natural. So maybe in the 20th century, maybe sometimes Hindemith put a lot of metronome markings, and when he was conducting, he was not respecting them systematically.
I see. And just a little fun tidbit about this symphony with the slow movement or the allegretto. I just brought up a list of the different movies it's been in. That's how popular it is. But the last main Hollywood blockbuster that had it, unfortunately, was X-Men Apocalypse, during a scene where all the world's nuclear weapons are launched. They're playing the allegretto from the symphony. But yeah, it's immensely popular. And I know in San Antonio, when I saw it there, it was a packed house, and the people in San Antonio don't even really support the symphony much. So that was surprising. But it is, very firmly placed in the pop culture. Shelley, go ahead.
Oh no, it's just a random thought, really. I remember watching an interview with Leonard Bernstein where he had what the kids refer to as a take, in specific reference to the second movement, where he basically said Beethoven, compared to other composers, was sometimes not the best at writing melodies, and the melody for that is a little bit ploddy and a little bit tedious, but he had a way of making them sound inevitable, and it's like every note was like the most intuitive right note to use next, that just kind of bores into the listener's mind in a way. And I think that kind of resonates with a lot of the most famous melodies that Beethoven has written. Is they are unique for the fact that they sound so intuitive, like you almost know what's going to happen next in a way. But also, obviously, to sort of say that is to kind of go against the grain and be a bit provocative with the way it's worded. But yeah, I think that thought is really borne out by this symphony, in particular the second movement. Obviously,
I'm unsure if I actually agree with Lenny on that one.
It's definitely a controversial one, but
and it's the second time you brought up Lenny too. So with Beethoven, he has very long-winded melodies, and he does have the shorter dotted melodies, such as an allegretto, the seventh, and the introduction of the fifth symphony. That's probably what he's referring to, but there's massive melodies in Beethoven that I feel that rival some of the best ever written. Sebastian, do you have any thoughts on Lenny perhaps not being a huge fan of the melodies themselves, just the way that they're developed and composed?
Yeah, I know this video, it's available on YouTube, but I think Bernstein was right about this specific movement. Indeed, there is no interesting melody in it, or at least the main subject of the da 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 da. It's very banal. The contra subject, the other voices, when the music is developing, and the harmonies are quite beautiful, but maybe that's not the best melodies or the most beautiful musical ideas taken separately. But I think that there are many instances with Beethoven when he indeed wrote and composed extremely beautiful melodies. For instance, in the violin concerto, in the slow movement of the fourth symphony, we have long melodies for the strings and the clarinets, and the melodies are absolutely wonderful. So it's a generalization and oversimplification from Bernstein, I would say, because he tended to generalize and say Beethoven was not gifted at composing melodies, but I disagree. And you have many instances in the seventh string quartet, for instance, the slow movement. You have the most beautiful melodies ever written, maybe with the exception of Bruckner and Tchaikovsky.
Oh yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think obviously the point is kind of overstated to just be a bit provocative. But yeah, even like again to return to the sonatas, like the Pathetique sonata, it has one of my most all-time favorite melodies as well, and one that I very much enjoy playing as well because it's just about within my skill range as well. But yeah, obviously Beethoven's work in general is littered with some of the most beautiful melodies ever committed to paper. But yeah, obviously in this instance, there's just there is a point to be made, but obviously you don't want to overstate it for the sake of being a bit provocative. But yeah, totally agree with that.
Okay, so Sebastian 1, Leonard Bernstein 0. Tyler, I'm going to have you talk about the eighth first, and then we'll get everyone else's opinions because it is an even number, and I remember that you like the even numbers. So Tyler, do you want to give your impression of what the Eighth Symphony is like for you personally?
I would love to, although I will make one statement on the seventh in its defense. Talking about Bernstein's comment and then relating that to Sebastian noting the banality of the, I suppose you could call it main theme or rhythmic device. And then also talking about the inevitability in Bernstein's comment. I kind of feel like that is intentional, at least when you're specifically talking about that movement of the Seventh Symphony. Sebastian also mentioned how it gains profundity with the addition of the other voices and the harmonic interplay, and I think that's kind of part of the point. Also, I think it relates to what you brought up, Jason, about how it's used in so many movies and tends to be used during scenes like the launching of nuclear warheads all across the world. There's kind of this sense of existential dread in that movement, kind of a sense of things are just inevitably marching to wherever they go and I have no control over it, and so nothing of what I do has any meaning. I think it can, even talking about banality, relate to the notion of a sense of horror, that your life is nothing very interesting and very exciting and there's not much that you can do about it. But that's all I have to say on the seventh. I now would be happy to talk about the eighth.
Go ahead, let's do the eighth.
All righty, so the Eighth Symphony, it would be, I don't know, it's almost difficult for me to talk about why I enjoy it so much, because in a way, kind of like with the Fourth Symphony, and I suppose it kind of applies to the Sixth Symphony too. Maybe this is an even symphony syndrome here. It's much less adventurous than its predecessor, I would say. I just simply really enjoy the contrast in theme there, the contrast from like the very exuberant themes to the very almost light-hearted themes that are used between them. It really gives me this is a very cliched comment for a classical music listener to make, but it gives me a sense of like how things occur in the natural world, right? Like you have elements of the natural world that are very thunderous and powerful, and then you have elements of the natural world that are very peaceful and pretty. And the way that they're interwoven together in that symphony kind of creates a feeling of how do I want to put this? Almost a transcendence for me. I really enjoy the feeling of like layers folding and then unfolding into very powerful statements to very subdued statements. But yeah, I would say that much like the other even numbered symphonies, it can almost have less to speak of because of the fact that it's not as adventurous. I think that's rendered obvious by the fact that it's not as spoken of as much or well known as much as the seventh or the fifth or the third.
Sebastian, what are your thoughts on the eighth? Like I had previously asked you, because my knowledge of the eighth, I was under the impression that he wrote the symphony to a metronome rather than putting down metronome markings. to how fast the tempi should be, that he actually sat down and was playing a metronome while composing. Is that true or not, Sebastian?
The second movement of the Eighth Symphony is a sort of homage to the inventor of the metronome, Mälzel. And the second movement is you just have the accompaniment is tit, 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 just an evocation of the metronome. And you have just the theme of the or the violins playing on this repeated notes of the winds, and it's indeed an homage to the inventor of the metronome in this movement, but it's also an homage to Mozart and Haydn, to the classical symphony. It's a quite short symphony, approximately 22 minutes. It depends, once again, if you follow his metronome indications. But I would say that I quite disagree. The symphony seems to be classical, but it is not so much. I find it very humorous, but very subversive also, because once again, it's the kind of joyful music which is extreme, and especially the finale, which is once again this kind of insane music, especially if you try to perform it by following his metronome indication. I know one performance which is absolutely mind-blowing. It's Riccardo Chailly with the Gewandhaus Leipzig. He's very close to the metronome indication, and the performance is absolutely fantastic. It's incredible. But the music is quite. The first movement is full of this kind of sharpness. Once again, it's the music is very enthusiastic at the beginning, and in the development, the music becomes more intense, and we find this kind of the same process as in the finale of the Seventh Symphony. The composer seems to be overwhelmed himself by the energy and the intensity of his own enthusiasm. And this is like once again, I want to make explode the orchestra, and you have this kind of repetitiveness, of insistence, of obsessive insistence in the development of the first movement. So it is not so, I would say, so classical and quiet and charming music. You have a lot of places in the music where you have lots of jokes. It's very subversive. It's not so comfortable, I would say.
I see. It's one of those symphonies that I usually, I'm a little bit different than Tyler. I go from the seventh to the ninth more often than I do to the seventh to the eighth. But I do enjoy the composition itself. But it's not one of those symphonies that I tend to revisit. Shelley, how familiar are you with the eighth?
Apologies. Yeah, a bit like yourself, it's one that I tend to overlook as well because again, it's sandwiched between the two sort of iconic symphonies. But Yeah, I tend to agree with everything that's just been said, but I think it's definitely one that I intend to revisit after this podcast because I think there's probably quite a bit of material within it that I have probably overlooked for the sake of going for the the big ticket items. So yeah, we can move on to the ninth now, I think.
Yeah, so the ninth, it's one of those. I would say the ninth is my all-time favorite symphony by Beethoven. Primarily for the first two movements, not necessarily the monumental conclusion of Ode to Joy. But I've actually gone to the symphony just to listen to the beginning and then walk out before Ode to Joy because I'm unsure if Beethoven, because he was definitely wrote this. I'm unsure if he actually knew like if the human voice was suitable for the type of music he was writing. So it's kind of all over the place with the singers, and I had a really bad visual one time when I saw it perform live, where the singers were up there and they sounded like goats to me for some reason, like bah, and it was really bad. But it might have just been that specific performance and not just the doc, the Ode to Joy altogether there. But this is one of the symphonies that I have probably listened to upwards of 500 times. Usually the first two movements, especially, but and being that I am a metalhead, I do like the dissonant Furtwängler recording from 1942, I believe, which is referred to as the Nazi Symphony by David Hurwitz. But I like the dissonant and the distortion of the recording. It just makes it sound more powerful to me. But that first movement with the double sonata form, it gets me every time I listen to it. Sebastian, what are your thoughts about the ninth?
Yes, this recording of Furtwängler is very special because the final, this is the way I feel it, is not absolutely not about joy. It sounds tragic, probably because of the context, but there is something implacable in this performance of the finale, and I don't feel joy at all. There is so much tension, and that's the darkest joy possible, imaginable, I guess. Once again, I don't have specific or particular things to say about the Ninth Symphony. Everything has been said. Probably it's the prototype for the forthcoming huge Quasimodo symphonies by Gustav Mahler later. The idea with the finale with soloist and chorus with a big revelation at the end.
Or if Bruckner's ninth was concluded Te Deum. I know they're in different keys, but it was. I know. Sorry, it was a bad joke. I know you have a completion of the ninth by Bruckner. One of the things I did read one time was that Bruckner intended, if he didn't complete the ninth, to use Te Deum as the conclusion, kind of like a quasi ode to joy. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry for stepping on you.
Yes, maybe one characteristic of the ninth is also that it was the main model for Bruckner as a symphonist himself. The scale, also the Eroica and the ninth were his main models. But the ninth has this kind of very mystical atmosphere at the beginning, and I think the movement I prefer remains the first because it's so powerful. It's so how to say that?
Well,
the logic, the logic of the development, the fugue in the fugal passages in the development, and all the musical ideas are so well organized. The form is so perfect. And you can notice also that the coda of this first movement is quite the same as the ending of the first movement of Bruckner's third symphony. You have the same bass line, dee, da, 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 with a chromatic bass line, and so it's I think Bruckner was very quite obsessed by the ninth, especially the first movement.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, I could definitely see that with okay, so we're gonna talk about like constructions of the symphonies, Beethoven, Bruckner, was heavily influenced by Beethoven, and the types of compositional tools he utilized, with the sonata form, and he kind of had the same palette for each symphony. It was like, the Allegro and Adagio, Scherzo, and Allegro again. You know, fast, and then a scherzo or adagio or slower fast movement, and it's he kind of repeats the template quite a bit that Beethoven had. Shelley, any thoughts on Beethoven's Ninth?
How many films has Ode to Joy appeared in?
I can look that up.
I can think of Die Hard off the top of my head, but yeah, I tend to agree in that the first movement is now probably my favorite, and again, it breaks the mold in that it's very unassuming as it opens. It's sort of just this almost ambient sound that hits you. It doesn't kind of announce itself immediately, and it sort of draws you in. And again, it's that example of sort of perfect construction before it sort of really picks up momentum. And yeah, in terms of sort of the towards the end of the symphony and the sort of the choral stuff, I do also tend to agree that he might not have known how the human voice would have interacted with what he was composing. And my understanding that he was pretty much completely deaf by this point, so he was one of the few people at the first performance that couldn't actually hear it. Am I correct in that?
Yes.
Yeah, which
but the question about the soloist, it's much worse in the Missa Solemnis. The Missa Solemnis has durations of approximately 80 minutes, and we have a long passages for soloists, but also the chorus. It's way more difficult to sing than the ninth. The ninth is quite easy compared to the Missa Solemnis.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, I do find it fascinating that for such a sort of broad piece of music, that such an ambitious piece of music, that the guy that wrote it could not actually hear the finished result, but it's one of his sort of immortalized works that's well, as you said, it's almost impossible to say anything on it now that hasn't already been said, other than the fact that yeah, I tend to agree. It's not perfect, and for me, I would still say the fifth, regardless of what you think of it aesthetically, I still see that as almost like a perfectly constructed piece of music, unlike the ninth, which soars to the clouds in terms of its brilliance, but also it is quite cumbersome at times as well. But also in that cumbersomeness, you do get, as you've already discussed, like the ambition of the later romantic composers that drew from that and sort of crafted these enormous bombastic works that are kind of almost weighed down by their ambition and sort of the size of the orchestras that they were attempting to use. And yeah, a lot of that again comes from their study of Beethoven's Ninth. So yeah, it's an interesting piece of work in almost because of its flaws as well, not in spite of them. And again, that sort of speaks to Beethoven, the composer, is that even in his flaws or the moments where he probably doesn't quite achieve what he set out to do, there's still a lot of instruction to be taken from it and a lot of artistry. And that also, again, is just one of the many reasons why he's such a fascinating composer, beyond, the many pieces that have become sort of cliches and memes over the years.
So do you want to hear some movies that Ode to Joy has been in?
Go ahead.
Of course, it was Die Hard. You're 100% correct there. But it was also in Sister Act 2, Back in the Habit, which has Whoopi Goldberg playing as a nun. It was in a Wii Nintendo commercial. Dead Poets Society, the Muppets movie. It was in the Muppets movie. So it's definitely made its rounds in pop culture. Of course, everyone knows it's Is it the anthem of the Olympics, Sebastian?
It's the
Pardon?
anthem of the European Union.
Yes, that's the anthem of the European Union. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Correct.
Interesting. So one last thing I want to mention about the ninth is that it kind of started the legacy of the ninth, like the ninth for composers, where after Beethoven wrote his ninth, it wasn't really until Dvorak where another composer completed his ninth. Correct, Sebastian?
Yes, but as Dvorak, the problem is that the symphonies from 1 to 4th, the first symphony was lost, the score was lost, and the 2 to 4th symphony were not edited when he was alive. So for a long time, for decades, Dvorak was known for having composed 5 symphonies and not 9. It was edited, discovered much later during the 20th century. So yes, yes, Shostakovich was the composer who wrote a 10th and 11th and 12th symphony fully completed. But of course, there was the shadow of the 9th. Mahler also. But it is a symphony about dying, simply. The last movement of Mahler's 9th is just probably, as Bernstein described, the experience of dying on the bed, and of course Bruckner didn't finish his 9th symphony, but I think Bruckner had always in mind the intention to compose a purely instrumental symphony and not to introduce no singers, no Te Deum at the end.
Yeah. Well, the issue with Te Deum is like the symphony is completely a different key than Te Deum, and it would just sound a little wonky if that was tacked on at the end. And plus, it doesn't really flow with the music, with the third movement being this great big vortex that sucks in everything in its path. Because you imagine Bruckner was at the end of his life, and he wasn't too happy about that, and that went into his music, and that vortex, holy crap! And then having the joyful Te Deum after that, it would be like, well, it wouldn't really match up. Tyler, don't recall you talking about the ninth. Did you have any final thoughts on the ninth of Beethoven? Tyler. Hello?
My apologies about that technical error. Anyway,
was it the kitty cat?
It was not the kitty cat this time. So I hit the mute button on my headset instead of the program like I normally do. So I was confused when I unmuted it and it was still muted. Anyhow, so any thoughts on the ninth? I don't have any particular thoughts on the ninth because I listened to it so much as a teenager and a young man that I have not listened to it in a very long time. I will say that it absolutely mystified me when I heard it. It was the first Beethoven symphony that I ever heard, the first piece of classical music that I ever seriously listened to. Throughout the first 3 movements, I sat in one place entirely enwrapped. And when it got to about the finale of the 4th movement, I stood straight up and just stood there and stared at my computer screen. I was listening to it on my computer until the music was done. And it was at that moment that I decided that I wanted to listen to classical music. So I guess that's more of a personal anecdote. Other than that, I can kind of agree with Shelley that the structure of it can seem a little unwieldy. But I don't really have much more thoughts other than that. I do kind of like that Sebastian brought up that the Missa Solemnis is more vocally challenging, which I could easily see. The Missa Solemnis is one of my favorite pieces by Beethoven, despite it being like a pretty conventional setting for a mass, from what I understand. Just melodically, it's very triumphant, very exuberant, very enjoyable to listen to, but I could easily see it being much more challenging vocally. But that's about all of the thoughts that I have on the Ninth Symphony.
All right, now on to the 10th. So I assumed that we're all familiarized with the 10th Symphony of Beethoven. I have listened to it at the gym while working out, lifting irons. I find it's very, very powerful stuff, but I know Sebastian, he's having a fit right now because I just brought this up. And so
There is not enough material to make something convincing out of it. That's just sketches. We just have to left them in the books or the sketches of Beethoven. It's impossible to make a symphony out of it.
yes, I agree, but the little material there is, I enjoy it. But yes, I don't consider it the 10th either. It's just sketches, and it's like having the sketches of Bruckner's finale be it of the Ninth Symphony. And even though there probably is more, isn't there more material that Bruckner left behind for his finale of his ninth than Beethoven left for his 10th?
Yes, by far. We have approximately, I would say, 60% of the finale. So it's the big part, the big missing part is the coda, is the ending. But for the rest of it, you can reconstruct the exposition, development, recapitulation from what we have. And we have then when you reconstruct the finale, you have 75% of the music, and just you have some sketches of the coda, and from these sketches maybe 40 or a little bit more than 40 bars of music, just 3 lines of sketches and some chords. You can build and imagine a coda from that, and using of course the previous material of the sonata form.
Right.
But I would like to say just a last thing about Beethoven ninth and the whole set of symphonies. I sent you a link on YouTube, a performance by Christopher Hogwood. He was one of the first to record a complete cycle of Beethoven symphonies on period instruments, and I find the sound, especially in the Ninth Symphony, extremely convincing. The orchestra, you have strong bass, and the horns and the trumpets and the timpani are playing sharp and loud. We can hear them, and it's not vulgar at all, but it's sharp, it's brutal, and I think it's the way it has to sound, because I don't like the way many orchestras and many conductors play Beethoven smoothly, round, like a la Barenboim, for example. I don't like at all the sound concept of Barenboim, and many other Riccardo Muti and Lorin Maazel and so on. Even Karajan, it's too smooth. It's too round, too comfortable, and I think we can find the sharpness, the extreme, the sharp intelligence, and the extreme sensibility of Beethoven, and the struggle of the man, the real violence, his anger, and his profundity, with this kind of playing the cycle of Hogwood, especially in the ninth. It's one of my favorite recording of the Ninth Symphony.
It's interesting. It's interesting you say that, because I'm nodding along in agreement. But you mentioned Daniel Barenboim, and I learnt or sort of became intimate with Beethoven through a lot of his work, both on piano and as a conductor. But it's interesting that you've put him in as one of the conductors that plays him too smoothly, and it's kind of making me think to sort of return to some of these works with a different ear now. And when you mentioned sort of making it sharp and making it brutal, seeing as this is, after all, a metal podcast as well, just to draw a comparison there, like a lot of modern metal kind of relies on making things smooth and flowing and quite soothing in a way. And my protest against that is, no, I want it to be quite sharp and jarring, and the transitions to really kind of grab you by the throat. And it's just interesting to draw that comparison with Beethoven as well, and just say, no, he does want obviously some of the melodies, as we've already touched on, are very beautiful, and they are very mystical in a way, but also you do want it to be quite abrasive. You want it to be brutal and to,
I think
really.
the Furtwängler is even more abrasive, honestly. I listened to the Hogwood, is that his name, correct? I listened to that you shared the other day, and I still feel like that Furtwängler recording is like if Beethoven's Ninth was turned into like metal, or just how dissonant and distorted it is. And it's kind of, you talk about violence, it's violent all over the place with the tempi. So my
Yeah, I think the performing this kind of music, not only the ninth, the Eroica, there are a lot of passages, the funeral march. To play it beautiful makes no sense. It's like saying I want to play the Rite of Spring by Stravinsky beautiful. That doesn't make sense. The music is violent. It's harsh. It has to be harsh.
Go ahead, Shelley.
It's a necessity, I think.
Oh no, I didn't have anything to add. I was just chuckling at the idea of playing the Rite of Spring beautifully. I just found that quite a funny statement. But yeah, obviously, like, yeah, there's certain kinds of music, and particularly in classical as well, where yeah, that sense of not just playing it harsh or brutally as well, but also kind of taking a sense of joy in that. And I think yeah, again, a lot of that comes from Beethoven and the conflict of the man himself, and how that was borne out in his compositions as well. It's just the inner conflict of reaching for beauty, but also looking at the kind of realism and the like jagged illogicalness of life sort of head on, and trying to translate that into musical form as well. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I just drew a parallel here in my little brain of mine, but I'm kind of viewing Beethoven as like the Plato of classical music, where everything before Beethoven, such as Baroque and classicism, is more like the pre-Socratic philosophers, and Beethoven's like the first one who came violently. It's like, here's my statement, let's clench the world by its throat, and have all-encompassing au revoir that is indomitable. Like we're in the shadow of Beethoven still, especially with his later works. That even Schoenberg was into the Grosse Fuge. And so the shadow of Beethoven's been lingering, far after his death, just like Plato, his shadow has been lingering over philosophy, in such a indomitable way for so long. So it's a little comparison there. It's like, I view kind of like Beethoven like the Plato of, or you can just slap me in the face and tell me I'm being stupid. But anyway, any final thoughts on Beethoven, Sebastian?
Yes, I think when you play the way I mentioned earlier, so sharp and brutal, the beautiful passages will be even more beautiful by contrast. So, and the struggle of the music will be more obvious, I would say. And the final thought, I will go back to our first question. Is Beethoven a classical or romantic? I don't know. I can't classify Beethoven. For me, I don't like the word modern, because the word modern doesn't mean nothing for me. I would say he's disturbing. He's subversive. He's strong. He's violent. He takes us the guts and the intellect at the same time. This is the balance between both, and this is why his music is so fascinating and so eternal.
100% agreed. Tyler, just final thoughts on Beethoven today before we wrap up?
Sure. I think that Beethoven's music is so captivating because it peers into everyday experiences that nearly everybody of any thought or sensitivity has, and is able to portray them in a way that reveals the sort of inner beauty of them. The thing is that when we feel something, the way we tend to communicate it to other people in regular day-to-day life is to undermine how much it's affecting us. But internally, it's very powerful. It's a very poignant and very, sometimes almost painful experience for us. And I think that Beethoven sort of reveals that in his music. I think that's spoken to by the fact that he was himself struggling with many powerful feelings due to his physical maladies, his deafness, and also perhaps due to some personal struggles that he had in his relationships with other people, like his sister, for instance.
Yeah,
And
he did not like his sister-in-law. It was his sister-in-law.
his sister-in-law, yeah, right, and his nephew, I believe, and the whole episode surrounding that. I know that there were other people, despite the fact that he had great friends, who found him unpleasant to be around. I think that's probably because of the same reason that many people today don't like being around very sensitive people, is that they can be very temperamental. But I also think that points to the fact that he felt emotions very profoundly, and I think that's seen in his music. Agree very much with Sebastian when he says that his music should be played very sharply and with a lot of emphasis, and you could almost say power behind it, because I think that's exactly what he would have wanted.
Cool. Shelley, your final thoughts?
Well, yeah, just to follow on, he was obviously not a healthy man, and by all accounts, he wasn't particularly pleasant to be around for a lot of people. But yeah, I think the reason he's such a struggle to classify is because he was one of the first composers to really imbue his music with his own identity, beyond a particular tradition or form and style. He always brought his own stamp to it, but also that stamp happened to have a kind of universal element, as Tyler alluded to there. He's expressing experiences and emotions and so on that everyone can relate to in some way, and that kind of makes him stand out by far more than the composers that preceded him. And it's something that the composers of the Romantic era were always trying to emulate in him as well, and they all ended up being influenced by him, almost to the extent where it's them also trying to inject their own personality into their music. And yeah, for that and all the other reasons we've already discussed, yeah, he was an above average composer.
Yeah, he was kind of good, actually. Yeah.
yeah, he's all right.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for the chat today. Hopefully you guys listening today enjoyed the episode. Just something a little bit different than a whole bunch of death metal and black metal. Talk about some classical music. And definitely want to thank Sebastian again for having his expertise on the program, as well as Tyler and Shelley for being on the program today. We will be including some musical excerpts, which you probably already heard. But anyway, I think let's close this with the first movement of Beethoven's Ninth.